Welcome to Health UnaBASHed, the show that is unapologetically passionate about health and wellness innovation that promotes a sustainable and equitable healthcare delivery and financing system. Hosted by digital health advocate, author, and thought leader, Bashe, the show looks at the thought-provoking ideas, people, and companies that are making a difference. I'm Gregg Masters, the producer and co-host of the show, and join Gil as we engage top industry talent who share their insights and best practices to create sustainable change. On today's show, our guest is Jamey Edwards, the Chief Operating Officer for StartUp Health, a company whose tagline is, quote, "We invest in health transformers, unite them into a global army, and broadcast their progress to improve the health and well-being of everyone in the world," unquote. Jamey joined StartUp Health in 2022 to lead its efforts to support scaling digital health innovation across its own operations and their portfolio. Jamey is a serial entrepreneur who brings over 25 years of experience in building successful companies, having led or participated in transactions worth over $10 billion of value over his career. He is an advisor, mentor, and coach to entrepreneurs nationwide, and a recognized thought leader in the field of digital health and entrepreneurship. And with that introduction, Gil, over to you.
Gregg, I want to thank you for that gracious introduction. As always, my friend, it's a pleasure to be with you. I also want to extend a special thanks to you, Gregg. These programs, which have become so popular as we speak to health innovators like Jamey Edwards, our special guest today, are fantastic because of your finesse at the production level. So I just want to tell our audience that Gregg is Gregg Masters, who has a master's in public health, has his own program called Pop Health with Fred Goldstein. You've got to listen to it. It's an amazing program. I listen to it. Gregg is my co-host, and I'm grateful for that. And he's also the executive producer of Health UnaBASHed. So, Gregg, many thanks to you. Jamey Edwards, it is a pleasure to have you all to myself for a change. Jamey and I have been on webinars together. We're actually part of a judging panel that's looking at incubators, accelerators, and private equity groups. Will be mobilized very soon for the Gallion Foundation. And Jamey comes to the program with extraordinary experience on that topic when it comes to incubators, accelerators, and private equity, because he's been interfacing with those sort of organizations since the very early stages of his career. As we all know, right now, Jamey has accepted a critical position. He's the Chief Operating Officer at StartUp Health. StartUp Health is really the safe haven and driving force for innovators, people who seek to transform the landscape of health. We obviously know we have a broken, fragmented health ecosystem. Jamey has been talking about that for years. He's been working diligently to piece this back together again. And now he's stepped into a role that I think takes full advantage of his life experience, his executive experience, his academic experience. He has an MBA from Cornell, undergraduate Cornell as well. And he's applying all of that life journey to help people succeed and ideally help sustain and improve people's lives. Jamey, welcome to the program.
Gil, so not worthy of that intro, but thank you so much.
Totally,
it's an honor.
Totally, my friend. You are so worthy of that. I've looked forward to having this conversation. And, you're a person who not only do I follow, and I recommend everybody follow Jamey on LinkedIn and Twitter. He's got quite a Twitter following. He's very active, and he will engage you. If you engage him, he will engage you. But, Jamey, your journey as a CEO, a serial CEO, with successful exits. You actually did one of the key SPACs in your last venture. You took a company public by way of a new hot economic formula, a SPAC, and then after turning over the role of CEO to the new company, took a very important role at StartUp Health. And I just wanted to start off and ask you a little bit. Generally, serial CEOs are the prime target for private equity groups to say, "Oh, he's free. We bank on a CEO. Let's grab him now before he's grabbed by some other equity group." And you go into this ambassadorial position at StartUp Health. What was going through that sort of thinking process at that moment? You said, "What's next on the adventure scale?"
Yeah, look, for me, Gil, I've really built my career around being a social impact entrepreneur. And that word impact is really important. Cloudbreak, when I was at the helm there, we built a company from scratch that really, was in 2,000 hospitals across the country, currently doing over 110,000 encounters a month, millions and millions of minutes of consultation a month. And certain issues became really important to me. And we measured our impact in a health equity perspective and lens when I was at Cloudbreak. And when I thought about what I wanted to do next, I said, well, look, during the first, I've built, two or three really successful companies now. I've had the opportunity to stand on the shoulders of other people as I've built my career. And now at 47, why work on one company when I could work on 300? And isn't it time to let some people stand on my shoulders and for me to help them achieve their goals, their dreams, and in startup health parlance, their moonshots? So the startup health opportunity, when I was looking at it, I did have opportunities to go be an entrepreneur in residence or an operating partner at a PE fund. Those opportunities were out there. But when I thought about where I could actually do the most good and have the most impact, it was within startup health. Steve Krein and Unity Stokes have built an amazing organization with the rest of the team. It's been a crazy 15-year journey for them, and they have a very long-term perspective on a 30, 40, 50-year journey where startup health is going to go in terms of its model. And I saw a chance to play a role. And, right now I'm in charge of what we call the health transformer experience at Startup Health. So making sure that every portfolio company that joins us, we're helping them maximize their value and maximize their impact. And the soul of Startup Health is really the community that Steve and Unity founded way back when. And I saw, how that impacted me at Cloudbreak Health, how the peer support groups, the events, the help during fundraising, all those things that we need to be successful entrepreneurs on that entrepreneurial journey. Startup Health provides and does it in a way under a mission. You can't ask for a pure mission than solving the world's greatest health challenges, and doing it in a moonshot model, which we now count 14 moonshots among Startup Health's current moonshot count. The latest two that we added were around diabetes and Alzheimer's. And, the plan is to do even more in the future. So from my perspective, I just saw an opportunity to really increase my impact at scale as a social impact entrepreneur and really help people. And this was by far the best platform I could find to do it.
Yeah, I love the fact that your money follows mission. And I don't think that they're separate aspects, but the passion gives you the courage and the persistence to go forward. As someone, we share a lot in common. We've both been in private equity situations, myself in GTCR, and yourself dealing with this. And then I travel the world dealing with companies large and small, and I see all sorts of presentations. And I remember at my earlier stages presenting to private equity groups and leaving a meeting and saying, that was just a great meeting. The meeting was supposed to be an hour. They kept us 2 hours. They loved us. And learning as I went on, no, they don't love us. It's a due diligence process for them. They're collecting information. They're learning so much about the space. I'm actually giving them a free 2-hour course, and they're just absorbing it for the next investment. And I often find when I'm dealing with amazing, brilliant, passionate startup entrepreneurs in the digital health space, that they often start with a story. My father had this condition. My mother encountered this. My sister, twice removed, who was a stepsister from someone else, experienced that. And so I've invented this, and it's needed. And there's a naivete about the system, the health ecosystem that they're about to encounter that is going to swallow them up alive. And I wanted to get your perspective on this, because I often think that entrepreneurs who come into our space have this sense of refreshing naivete. And what they don't realize is it is financially driven. It is disconnected. Providers are not aligned with payers. Payers are not aligned with the people who are inventing products. Product people are not aligned with the policymakers. And nobody is really bringing the patient into the center of the conversation. It's all about the ka-ching, the money. What's your perspective on that?
Look, I think you said it well before, which you said that money follows mission. And, it's interesting, right? If you're watching TV these days, and I've been watching, there's a bunch of shows about these entrepreneurs who got out over their skis. You've got The Dropout, which is about Theranos. You've got We Crashed, which is about WeWork, and you've got Super Pumped, which is about Uber. And these were all great businesses at the point in time in which they were conceived. And we hope there was purity of mission with how they were conceived. It's like, as an entrepreneur, when someone says, and there's a quote from Elizabeth Holmes, I want to be a billionaire. It wasn't, I want to build a company that impacts people. Or I want to solve this problem around blood. It's like, she wanted to be a billionaire. Well, I remember when I first fell in love with entrepreneurship, and it was in college. I took an entrepreneurship course at Cornell through this very hallowed business professor, this guy, David Ben Daniel. And the first time I wrote a business plan, I was hooked, because his theory of what the definition of entrepreneurship was you have an idea in your head, you make it real, you make it matter to people, and you make it impact society. And that really resonated with me. And so all of a sudden I was like, look, if I can build a bunch of great businesses that are really helping people, the money will follow, right? Like building a great company, you'll build value, money will follow. And so for me, entrepreneurship it's all about being really personal. And if you have a personal story that you've got conviction around, and I think healthcare, Gil, is one of these industries that changes from the inside out. So I think it's really hard. I think it's why Silicon Valley still is really yet to crack the code on building great healthcare companies. It's because the great healthcare companies that have been built have been people who had a problem and wanted to address that problem. It wasn't because they thought healthcare was a great market. It wasn't because they saw some sort of disequilibrium that they could solve. It was because they had a personal experience that drove them wanting to build a company that impacted that personal experience. And I think there's a tremendous amount of value in that and a purity to it. And when you're at the earlier stages of the capital structure, pre-seed, seed, Series A, you're getting these companies in their purest form, pre-revenue most of the time, trying to find their product market fit. And they've got a problem statement that they're then trying to come up with a solution statement for. And to me, that's the fun, right? That's the fun. That's the early part of that value creation curve where I think the rubber really meets the road. And that's what we get to do at Startup Health. And it's fun, it's meaningful, and it gives us a chance to lay a great foundation for these entrepreneurs and let them know that on their entrepreneurial journey, which by the way, Gil, you've been through this, it's lonely. It's lonely sitting in that CEO seat. I'm sitting in that founder seat.
I got a two-part question for you, my friend. Two-part question. Ready? This is very difficult. I wish I could do this in a linear fashion, but one is, listening to you talk, and I'm speaking to entrepreneurs, I sometimes say, what J code are you going to go after, particularly digital health? What code are you going to fall under there? And they look at me like, code? What are you talking about? And I said, well, how are you going to secure revenue? Well, doctors are going to buy it, or patients are going to buy it. And I said, no, they're not. What's your reimbursement strategy? So I'll park that for a second. What I want to ask you is, you've been to the campfire a few times. You're a successful entrepreneur. You've started businesses. They've struggled. You've pressed forward. You were persistent and courageous, and never. As the sign says behind you, for our audience that's listening, it says, "Don't give up the ship." You've got to be a bit of Ernest Shackleton in this business, right? You got to survive no matter what. From your experience when you're dealing with digital health entrepreneurs at Startup Health, what do you think some of the biggest challenges they face in terms of a learning curve is?
And if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Health Unabashed on Healthcare Now Radio. Our guest is Jamey Edwards, the Chief Operating Officer for Startup Health.
Yeah, such a good question. And those challenges, I think everyone assumes when you're starting a company, your plan is, 3 to 5 years, I'll be out and it's going to be a hockey stick and revenues are going to grow like this. And that's not the way it goes at all. I mean, if I take a look at, Cloudbreak, it was all over the place. And there's a lot of struggles and everyone goes through the same ones. How am I going to make payroll this month? We have this one major client and they're thinking about leaving us. What do we do? And those are long nights and they're tougher. Hey, I really like this employee, but they're not really doing a great job. No one teaches you, Gil, how to hire and fire people. You just do that by learning how to do it and trying to be as compassionate through the process as you possibly can. But those are the difficult challenges that we face. When you're sitting in that founder and CEO seat, people are relying on you. And that's a lot of pressure. And so what I try and teach our entrepreneurs is to have conviction under that pressure, to trust their instincts and their gut. What entrepreneur do you know that doesn't have imposter syndrome? Oh my God, how did I get here? Does anybody understand that I don't know what I'm doing? And then every time someone looks at me and they say, oh, Jamey, look at your track record. I'm like, guys, I'm still figuring it out to this day. What I have a lot of confidence in is my judgment, my ability to evaluate a situation and under what are imperfect circumstances, and try and make the best decisions possible I can for my team. And I think a lot of what has made me is that I've lived under authoritarian regimes as a business person. And that's not the type of culture I wanted to create in my businesses or that we teach to create in Startup Health. It's really about servant-oriented leadership. I realized early on that my role was to serve everyone in my company and make sure they had the resources that they needed, the coaching they needed, the mentoring that they needed, the capital that the company needed, the right corporate culture. It wasn't that they were there to serve me. It was the other way around. And I think that's what I try and teach our entrepreneurs.
Yeah, you're unique in that way. I as I travel the world, I do meet people who fit the Jamey Edwards model, which is there's passion, there's knowledge, there's the desire to learn from colleagues, to learn from industry, and I also meet people who sort of say, "I know it all. You have nothing. You have nothing to teach me." Startup Health, you're a bit of an incubator, you're a bit of an accelerator, you're a bit of an equity group. What's the magic? I mean, Startup Health has created not just a business model; it's created almost its own sense of culture and community. What was the magic behind Startup Health that differs? And my experience with Startup Health and Stephen has been really through the J.P. Morgan experience, year after year after year, and being in that room. I've sort of chose not to go over to J.P. Morgan, but to hang in the Startup Health sort of building, the theater, and learn from that experience. Because for me, it's even as a seasoned business leader, I learned so much from just listening to the people, not on the stage, but actually the people walking the halls. Tell me a little bit about the culture, because I think that culture both crushes innovation, but I think it can be the rocket fuel to innovation.
I couldn't agree with that more. I think the magic behind Startup Health is the community. It is where the rubber meets the road. It's the fact that we are building an organization for entrepreneurs by entrepreneurs. Unity and Steve at their core are entrepreneurs. And at that, they're incredibly progressive with how they think about business and models and building culture. They've been incredibly thoughtful every step of the way with how they've built Startup Health. And so I remember, by the way, being a later stage entrepreneur at this point in time where my company was already doing 12 million of revenue. I wasn't early stage. And I remember being like, I need to be a part of Startup Health. I was on the outside looking in. They were able to create an environment and a story that was bigger than themselves. And as entrepreneurs, that's really what we want to be a part of. We want to be able to create that story that's bigger than ourselves, not about ourselves, but bigger than ourselves. That to me is what's always been most gratifying about the company building or value creation process. And Startup Health, with their structure, with the support that we provide the entrepreneurs from day one of being part of our ecosystem, with the purity of the mission of solving the world's greatest health challenges, with the media engine that's been created to amplify the stories of everything that's happening within the Startup Health ecosystem, with the network relationships that we have with VCs and industry and health systems and pharma and payers, bringing all of that together into one place to create the most supportive environment possible for an entrepreneur that helps guarantee their success. I think it's been a critical thing. And I have to tell you, Gil, one of the greatest joys I've had in the last 4 months has been getting to know the Startup Health portfolio companies. And while I am there mentoring and coaching them, I'm the one who walks away from the conversation inspired by what these entrepreneurs are trying to accomplish and do. It's a pretty incredible situation.
Anything that you see that sort of, without mentioning company names, but sort of new ideas or approaches that you see that you sort of say, wow, that is going to be transformative in health, in the coming years?
God, I think there's so much, Gil, we're in the early innings of what is a broader digital health transformation. If you take a look at all the other industries that are out there, healthcare is currently last in terms of where we are, in terms of integrating digital into our strategies and rebuilding the healthcare system around technology. And that to me is a huge opportunity. So if you take a look at the trends of the last few years, clearly COVID catalyzed telemedicine. And while we've seen backsliding back to what is more in-person visits and things of that nature, it's still 8 times where it was when we started COVID. And if you take a look at closed-end healthcare systems like Kaiser or like the VA, who manage a patient experience from end to end, over 50% of their visits pre-COVID were telemedicine driven, right? It was phone, it was chat, it was email, and there was no new technology that came out during COVID. All of a sudden, we had some new holographic telemedicine technology that people were like, oh, cool, telemedicine's great. No, we relied on technologies that were already implemented that everybody already knew how to use. The phone, video through their iPad, whatever it might be, or through the web. And we implemented those into workflows that allowed us to accomplish the goal. So, in telemedicine's case, it was like necessity was the mother of adoption, not necessarily invention. When it came to some of these new technologies that are out there, like artificial intelligence, which people were very wary about in the beginning, we're starting to see more evolved models that make AI really work and sing. So not as a replacement for physicians, but as an augmenting tool.
I love that you said that. I call it augmented intelligence, not artificial. How can intelligence be artificial? And I think that scares. You said a few things that I just want to unpack for our listeners because they're so important. You talked about how telehealth, because of COVID, really made this surge forward. We were separated from each other. Medical care had to continue. And now there's a sort of a push back to the doctor's office. Now, I really do understand that some things need to be seen in a doctor's office. But I also understand some things clearly don't need to be seen. But I do understand it's about reimbursement models and that doctors get reimbursed at a different level for an in-person visit than they do for a telehealth visit. And so the economics of healthcare is pushing back the convenience of healthcare and accessibility. That's one thing I think you said. I really want to appreciate it. I really appreciate this. You also talked a little bit about the fact that we're dealing actually with health disparities. You talked about that earlier, and Cloudbreak was really at the cutting edge of trying to get its arms around, how do we close the divide on access to care? So you talked about that. You also talked about, as we just said, augmented intelligence. And I'm just struck by, let's say, people would say, I'm going to crowdsource an idea. I want to crowdsource funding. I want to crowdsource a big idea. I want to crowdsource a moonshot. People say, absolutely. And what I'm taken with is human behavior, time and time again, where I spoke to a nurse recently about a case that I was really focusing in on. And the nurse said, I don't have time to read the EMR. And I'm saying to myself, we're talking about interoperability. Forget about interoperability. We can't get people in the same system to look at the electronic health record for a patient. When nurses are changing on a floor every day, we're doomed. If we can't create a sense of collaborative behavior with each other and with patients, what difference does technology make if everybody's shrugging their shoulders? I wish we could speak all day, and we probably should do this again and again. But I want to spend our last 2-3 minutes talking about your big plans. You're like big, hairy, audacious goals in this role. You're a senior position. You've got oodles of experience. You care with passion about improving care and access to care for people. If we're having this conversation, and we'll be speaking to each other much sooner than that, but if we were to have this conversation 6 months from now, a year from now, and you to say, Gil, I'm targeting for Startup Health, my voice, my role in digital health. Here's what I hope we can accomplish in the next year. What do you want to put your finger on?
I hope that within the next year at Startup Health, we have revamped what is already a great platform to make it even better. So that, one, at Startup Health, we've gone out and we raised more money to put against these other moonshots, some significant capital, so that we can go out and fund more and more companies. If right now we're, 300 active companies, 400 companies we've invested in, I think in the next few years, we want to be at 1,000 companies that we've invested in. We see a huge scaling effect that can really drive healthcare forward. And, again, for me, I'm here to learn. And as I learn, I implement the things that I learn, as well as share my experience with these health transformers. So I'm learning about new industries, about, new subsectors of healthcare that I didn't even know existed. And I'm hoping that we at Startup Health are going to have a huge impact on the future of how innovation is done in healthcare. Make it easier, more accessible, more easy to fund these entrepreneurs, and make it easier for them to scale their businesses, so that, we're not so focused on unicorns per se, but we're just focused on everyday value creation and kind of that entrepreneurial grind of just moving these businesses, these companies, and these entrepreneurs forward so they can achieve their moonshots.
First of all, you've got to be successful. Our well-being and health is on the line. And so we're not to put pressure on you, Jamey, but we're going to put pressure on you. One last really quick question. You just held a Startup Health gathering in Florida at Vive. And historically, it's been JP Morgan. Are you going to be back at JP Morgan this year?
Currently, we have a partnership with Vive and with Health that has been incredibly successful. The festival, the Startup Health Festival at Vive, was an incredible setup where I think Startup Health, quite frankly, was the center of gravity in the startup world, for that festival. We are going to be at Health again in November in Las Vegas. So I think that's going to be the center of our efforts. And are we going to be at JP Morgan again? Time will tell. Right now for us, I think we're moving in the direction of partnering with other conferences, Health, Vive. We're taking a look at maybe, frontiers in, Europe, and evaluating our plans. We want to make the Startup Health Festival more than once a year, right? We want to try and get people together on a quarterly basis.
I love it. Everyone, Jamey Edwards, Chief Operating Officer, Startup Health, great entrepreneur, great advocate for digital health here on Health Unabashed. Thank you, Jamey.
Thank you. Appreciate the time.
And that's a wrap for today's broadcast. We want to thank our listeners for tuning in and our special guest, Jamey Edwards, the Chief Operating Officer for Startup Health. Do follow his work on Twitter via @Jamey Edwards, and that's JAMEY, and @Startup Health, respectively, and on the web via www.startuphealth.com. You can learn more about Health Unabashed on the program page at healthcarenowradio.com. We are weekdays at 10:30 a.m., 6:30 p.m., and 2:30 a.m. Eastern, or for you left coasters, 7:30 a.m., 3:30 p.m., and 11:30 p.m. Pacific. Do keep the conversation going with Gil and me on Twitter by connecting with us via @Gil_Bashe, and that's BASHE, and Gregg Masters, MPH, and that's Gregg with 2 G's. And do remember to tag your tweets with #HealthUnabashed. Until next time, stay unapologetically passionate about improving health.